This episode is made possible by our generous patrons.
Welcome to episode 131 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book
And then see the movie.
I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we discuss the final third of J.R.R. Tolkien's 1955 novel, The Return of the King. All right, James, I have a 45-question fill-in-the-blank survey and questionnaire for you about the appendices that we have covered. I hope you came prepared and you did all your studying.
It really did kind of feel like I was cramming for a test and like trying to remember names and dates and all these things.
I'm going to need to know the third king of Numenor. I don't know.
I need to know the exact lineage of father, grandfather, and great-grandfather of Theoden.
That's right.
Right now. Go.
Yeah. No, yeah. I mean, that was pretty fun getting to those parts. Some of it very interesting, some of it very dry. It seems like it's definitely there for the people who want to go really deep. And I've discovered through reading that I am not one of those people. Some of it was interesting. I'm kind of glad I read through it. I didn't necessarily, absorb all of it. I sort of skimmed through it, stopping at sections that interested me more. And that's all I really needed out of it. So if you were ever curious, like what was in the appendices at the end of the book, wondering if you should check them out, I think skim through them, look for interesting stuff. There is a bit of backstory. There's a couple sentences here and there that indicate like what happened after the events of the novels, which are kind of cool. We'll get into. But for the most part, unless you're someone who really wants to dive deep, I don't know. I think you can skim.
Yeah, I skimmed. So I skimmed some of it. My book had the first three parts were the ones that I read all the way through, and then from there, there's sort of like your family trees and your pronunciations and things like that. The reasons why things are pronounced certain ways and why like translating them into modern day English is hard from Elvish and things like that. That's the stuff I skimmed through. I found myself to be really pretty much engaged all the way through the three parts. I guess it does get bogged down sometimes when it's kind of sort of just listing kings and who their son was and why they had their names that they had because of certain battles or deeds that they did. But I think everything that kind of in any way shapes the world of specifically this story of the Lord of the Rings, sort of the Third Age, the end of the Third Age here, specifically everything to do with like sort of the First Age and sort of the Valar and like why Sauron is the way he is and Morgoth and all of this stuff that you don't like. That's just like added context that I think you start to understand people's powers. You start to understand Gandalf a little more, I think, and you understand like why there maybe is kind of guiding forces that are helping along the Fellowship. That stuff I find to be really interesting. The king's lineage and things like that, maybe less so.
Okay, fair enough. We'll touch on that here at the end of the episode. Spend a little bit of time on it, but not too much. But before we get to all that, and before we even get into our summary, this is our final episode on the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the books. Obviously, we are going to do the massive movie next week, which I'm looking forward to. I'm even thinking about watching all three films, in preparation.
I was also thinking that, yeah.
Yeah, we'll see if I have the time, but I mean, what else? Maybe I will. But this is going to put the cap on our book coverage, and I want to save a little bit of wrapping up for the very end once we've discussed it all. But just here at the top, like any general thoughts or any sort of observations you want to make about the process of reading all of these books, and coming to end with the trilogy here and now, where we're at with life and the state of the country and everything else going on right now in the world. Yeah,
I mean, these stories have meant so much to me growing up and over the years, and just overall shaped definitely like what sorts of fantasy I'm into, and just in general stories that I engage with. And this ending is so, it feels, because we're doing it for the podcast, it feels very final for the book. It feels like closing a book on Tolkien's like masterpiece, like closing a chapter. And like we still have The Hobbit to dive into, which will be so much fun. And you know, we have the movie episode coming out, which like, you know, Peter Jackson's trilogy is like, for my money, is kind of, I mean, as influential as anything that Tolkien did for me, you know what I mean? Like in terms of filmmaking and the things that he did to, like, I mean, it just changed blockbuster cinema forever, and even just like fantasy and like, you know, fantasy wouldn't be the same today without that adaptation. I mean, it just, this, for whatever reason, this feels really final right now with Tolkien, and having just watched the biopic, which we'll be talking about as our bonus episode this month. We're gonna have 2 bonus episodes, but the first one's gonna be about the biopic Tolkien. Having just watched that and kind of Tolkien. Yeah, it's a habit. I'm always going to call him Tolkien, but it is.
I know. I can't break myself of it.
It is Tolkien. Yeah, but just so having just watched that, I think just knowing that his love for language maybe even, you know, surpassed his love of this Middle Earth that he created and everything like that, and this was sort of a vessel for those languages, kind of blows my mind, and like the history that he created, and it's just like it never will be done again. Nobody will ever, I in my opinion, maybe people will strive for it, but I guess it can never be done for the first time again. Sort of creating this language, this world with everything that he did was in some way in service to this world. And you know, you have your George R. R. Martins and you have your J.K. Rowlings, and who have like massive fantasy worlds that you feel like you could explore forever, but something about Tolkien and the way that he does Middle Earth is just, I don't know. It's because it comes from a place of, rather than story, I think it comes from a place of language, and that sort of shapes the world. It's kind of unique even today.
I agree that it's unique. Yeah, I mean, I guess when you say it won't be done again, it hasn't been, you know, like that, I'm a little bit like, I don't know about that. But if you're trying to say that done in this way, I definitely agree, because Tolkien was a philologist, and he brought his particular academic studies to bear in creating this world, and he was particularly good at certain things, and that influenced the way he crafted this mythology and history into his work. And yeah, I mean, he was definitely one of the first to do it. And I was thinking about how, reading through the appendices, I was like, I wonder how much this inspired someone like Martin to put out A World of Ice and Fire, which is this massive book containing all of the backstories and histories. Like, it's like, and so like you said, Rowling, like so many different famous fantasy writers feel like they have to just create this massive mythos and world building, and that's so baked into fantasy now. And I do think a lot of that comes from Tolkien, like his shadow. Like, if you want to be a, you know, quote unquote real fantasy writer, you have to invent all this stuff for your world, and just has to be fully realized and fleshed out and lived in, and, you know, going back hundreds of years. And I think that expectation, a lot of that comes from this, because that's something that it seems like Tolkien really delighted in. But yeah, I mean, I think it's being done. I think I see modern writers doing it. They're just doing it in their own ways, and they're doing it in ways that play to their strengths. Yeah, that's not to discount anything anybody's doing currently. I think it's just the fact that he did it kind of, you know, I'm sure people did it before him, but the fact that he did it first and set this standard, sort of like you're talking about, which is just kind of, no one can set that standard again. Someone could set a new standard and like sort of create a new trend of popularity like he has. But yeah, I mean, it's just to have read it and like to understand the stories as I do now, and have it be like a sort of familiar story, and yet be able to dig into it more and more. I really enjoyed reading Return of the King again. There's some fun stuff that isn't in the films that I think is interesting to think about, especially when put up against sort of the fact that Tolkien dislikes allegory. We've talked about it multiple times, and the fact that the biopic kind of leaned into the allegory. So like, yeah, it really did.
You know, like, but then there's something here in at the end of Return of the King that you're like, okay, so this kind of could again ring true for something that's allegory to Tolkien's experiences. And I think that brings to light again the nature of, like, I think an author has to write from a certain perspective. You write what you know sometimes. You know what I mean? I'm not saying that they're locked into that, but they're influenced by it. So like the fact that, you know, people draw allegory to things that he went through, I think is just a natural thing that's going to happen. And I know he disliked it, but I think he disliked it for the fact that people were potentially using it to discount sort of his artistic licensing and sort of like the things that the effort that he put into it.
And we've hit on that a lot, I think, in this discussion. So I don't want to linger on it too much, but I agree with you, and I definitely was drawn to making some comparisons throughout the end of this, which we can touch on as we go. One thing I wanted to bring up is I never read this book, right? Like I mentioned before, this is the one that I definitely never, because I never finished Two Towers. So now I have completed the entire series, and I can look at it and see it for the entirety of it, and it's given me an interesting perspective on this as a series, and it's also interesting to compare it to the films that come out later, and the way that it sort of reignited the Lord of the Rings mania that was going on in the 70s and 80s and 90s too. And I'm not saying it had completely died out, but you can't think that Peter Jackson's trilogy didn't all of a sudden explode Lord of the Rings mania again. It definitely did. And it has sort of made this series can have even longer legs than it would have had already. But it is interesting to look back at the series, regardless of the films, as being so landmark, so influential. You have Terry Brooks, you have Michael Moorcock, which came out and he wrote this essay, basically trashing Lord of the Rings. And I read that earlier because, I wanted to have some like opposing viewpoints, and you have Martin, who I've already talked about, who I feel like is writing sort of in dialogue with Tolkien, and it's just like it's everywhere. And I feel like it is a valuable piece to have read for me as someone who occasionally writes fantasy. And I think it's useful to see the historical perspective of it. And much like when we covered Apprentices of Mars and how influential that was in science fiction, I feel like this was also interesting in an academic way of going back and seeing the history of fantasy and a series that is clearly monumental and very important.
I have a question for you, just because I feel like within sort of how you're talking about it, do you think that the legend of Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, and specifically Return of the King, because you hadn't read it, do you think it lives up to sort of what your sort of how you remember it and how you think about it? Did it live up to the text itself, or do you think it's being propped up by sort of all of the mythos and the whole story and the movies and sort of like you said, Tolkien mania, like Lord of the Rings mania?
Yeah, I think that actually would be something interesting to touch back on at the end of this episode. I want to get through this because often when I discuss things in depth with you, it helps me sort of crystallize my views on things. And I want to give myself an opportunity to have that discussion first. And then by the end of the episode, I want to touch on that. Like, where do I think this fits as far as like my expectation and what it delivered and how I felt about the series as a whole. I think that's an ongoing conversation we'll have into next week too, but in particular for the books, I think that would be a nice way to end our coverage of the books, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So since I'm punting that till later on, do we want to touch on, have you put any thought on the role of Gollum before we get into the summary of these final sections? I know that's something we talked about last week. We had someone write in talking about how basically, it was basically kind of echoing some things we kind of said, where it was like Gollum is evil to Frodo's good, and he is sort of the corrupted versus the pure and the uncorrupted, or the someone who gives in, right, versus someone who fights back. I think those waters are a little muddier than that, but that was some of the feedback we got. And I know that's something that I resisted fully answering last time, especially trying to make allegory or any sort of comparison to other thing. Is that something you've thought about at all?
I mean, I was racking my brain trying to think about what he meant to the story as well. And something else that came to me is just like this idea of, this is more of a surface level, obviously, interpretation of it, and it's clearly there. But like Gollum is an example of specifically Smeagol finding the ring and having to bear it alone. Whereas I think like the story of Frodo, as we talked about last week, and the story of Sam and sort of the Fellowship as a whole, is that there couldn't have been only one ring bearer to completely sort of push back against this evil. So it took more than just one person or one thing. It took like the coming together of all races of men and all everybody. So yeah, I mean, other than that additional thing that I hadn't really thought about, just like this idea of he is the lone bearer of this ring for, I think like 100 years or hundreds. I think it's a very long time. I can't remember off the top of my head how long it is, but just to battle with it alone makes him a character who, like understandably what became as insane and like as crazy and sort of like
Obsessed,
yeah. So like if Frodo's by himself for a couple hundred years, I have no doubt that he would probably end up something like Smeagol and Gollum.
Sure. Well, and so I think that comes around to something I kept seeing coming up in this story, and that was sort of the strength inherent in mercy. And we see it kind of come up again and again, and I think he's one of the key figures of that, because it's mercy over and over again that stays Sam's hand and makes Frodo not kill him, and makes Gandalf not kill him. And it turns out in the end that was the right decision, right? Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons that the ring is able to be destroyed, is because of mercy. We see this echoed again later on in this book with Sauron and some of the mercy that's getting shown to him. Now, you can argue whether or not it was the right thing to do or not, but it seems to me that the Tolkien's trilogy is repeatedly telling us it is a sign of strength to be able to show mercy to your enemies, or show mercy to those who are maybe misguided. And I think that's one of the things that the series is trying to say. I don't know that I always agree with it in every situation. That's something I think we can talk about. I also think that sometimes it's presented in a way that is like, if you are merciful, then the divine will sort of take up your cause, because it feels like that's why it works.
Right. It feels idealistic. It feels like you're like, if you inherently, like I talked about last week, sort of the idea that Tolkien, after everything he's been through, still believes in like the genuine good-natured like goodness of the world. If you look at it through that lens, then mercy wins out. But I think that not only do you run into a situation where you could be taken advantage of, all of these things in sort of a real world sense, but I think overall it's a great message. I think in general, yes, mercy does show courage. It takes courage to be merciful, I would say.
So in the risk of getting a little sidetracked, Michael Moorcock's essay about someone brought to my attention. I think it was last night at a writing. I was virtually attending. It's called Epic Pooh, and it is Pooh, as in Winnie the Pooh.
Right.
And in it, he compares Tolkien to essentially fantasies, like adult fantasies version of Winnie the Pooh. And Moorcock he's sort of a political anarchist. He reminds me a little bit of Alan Moore in a way. Like he seems like I mean, now I'm not at all like a Moorcock expert, so people might bristle at that description. I fully recognize that, but from what I was reading, he really doesn't like how sort of he finds Lord of the Rings like childish and sort of reductive and designed to be comforting and to not challenge you and to reinforce existing sort of conservative values. And he did it in a way that the essay is sort of pot stirring in a way. It seems like it's deliberately trying to, stir up, anger and get attention. But he's not completely wrong either. Like there were some good points being made in there. And it also, I think that both types of literature can exist. And I think that we can have comforting fantasy that doesn't challenge us and makes us feel better about the world, which is definitely what I think this book largely does in this series. And then there can be completely subversive writing that challenges everything you think and forces you to be uncomfortable. And there's a time and a place for that. I don't know that I'm comfortable saying that one is inherently better than the other. I think a lot of it comes down to like your taste and what you want, and also it can vary. But I guess I'm trying to say that I understand that point of view, and I know that there are a lot of people out there who don't like Tolkien, and I think that's part of it. I think that they look at it as sort of a conservative bastion of fantasy, and they see it as something that props up the patriarchy, that perpetrates this idea of like wise old men who are going to save the day and who we should look to in times of strife. And there's a lot of troubling things in here, or things that don't jive with me politically. But I also am able to find comfort and to enjoy reading it and to be comforted in a time which reading a comforting story is nice. And I think there's value in that. So I guess I haven't decided where I'm at, other than to say that I'm pretty sure I am not a ultra Lord of the Rings fanboy after finishing this series. However, I did enjoy reading it, and I do respect it greatly,
right,
for what it is.
So, tons of stuff to talk about here. Because you just said it, I think the idea of being like an ultra fanboy can be almost dangerous to the source material itself, because like life is about diversity. It's about having different kinds of stories. And like from somebody like this author that you were just telling me about, it seems to me very closed off. Like it seems to me if you can't approach a story and understand that it's going to be from a certain perspective that doesn't completely fit within the parameters that you set as good material, then I see that as somebody being somewhat, like I said, closed off or maybe ignorant toward to just completely say that something because it's so, because it's childish or idealistic or sort of like simple, doesn't make it bad. And I think that's something that we're seeing a lot today. People seeing things that are broadly appealing as blanket bad, like things that are broadly things that anyone can understand as bad. And I just think that's inherently not true. I mean, and again, maybe it comes down to taste. Maybe there are people who do think that the only thing that's good is something that subverts expectations, but I think subverting expectations are made that much better when there are expectations to be set. So if there's an idealistic story like this, when you go and to make your version of it, of some sort of like completely different, twisted, gruesome, dark, and like, completely bleak ending, it's going to make it that much more powerful. So sort of like having both is this nice balance. So I don't know. I bristle at sort of the idea that just because it's like sort of more simplified or broadly appealing makes it bad. But I also do acknowledge the fact that like if you're talking about sort of propping up patriarchy, a lot of the things that you just talked about, clearly it's a book from the 50s and it is guilty of that. And it's not to say that like this should be like the best fantasy novel of all time, and I see it as one of them, but I'm definitely not closed off enough as like a fanboy to say like there will never be anything better. Because I think like that, to think that way is cynical in itself. To say like this is the best thing that there will ever be and nothing will ever be better than it is just, I don't know, again, closed off. Like then you're not open to new experiences. So I think there's a balance in the middle somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, the essay, honestly, I want to read it again. There was a lot of references to other books. He talks about C.S. Lewis and other writers who've been propped up over time. He has a vested interest. He's a fantasy writer himself, and he's sort of trying to differentiate himself from these others. Honestly, I think that could be like a bonus episode, would be just like to us read this essay, have you read it beforehand and actually talk about it. Because on one hand, I also feel like I'm maybe misrepresenting what was said a little bit, You know what I mean? Not giving it the nuance, not giving it the backing that he had. Right. There was a few things in there that I would love to also sort of react to that I disagreed with. There were a few things I agreed with, but I'm realizing that getting into it really would take a lot more time than I want to devote to it in this episode. Yeah. So maybe that's something we'll revisit in a future bonus episode. Probably not this month, but somewhere down the line we could touch on it if we wanted to, if that sounds interesting to people. I will link the essay in the show notes. Again, I'm not saying I endorse this viewpoint, but I'll link it in there since we talked about it. And if you guys want to check it out, read it for yourself. If you're a big Lord of the Rings lover, it may anger you. If you have doubts, maybe you'll see some of them represented there. But let's get into the summary here before we dally too long. We left off on Chapter 4, which is called The Field of Cormallen. The story returns to the Field of Cormallen, continuing from Book 5, Chapter 10. The Eagles arrive, and the captains of the West are victorious. Frodo and Sam are rescued by Gandalf, and all the company meets again in Ithilien. So again, we're kind of going back to the armies of men here. We see them victorious. We see the Eagles come down. Gwahir and Gandalf rides on this Gwahir, and they go and they rescue Frodo and Sam from Mount Doom. So, yeah, what did you think of this chapter?
I think it's really cool to see the perspective of Aragorn, Gandalf, the armies that are trying to, fight against Mordor that's around them on all sides. Seeing like the impact of the moment that they dropped that the ring fell into the fires of Mordor, to see the reaction and sort of know like a blow has been struck is something that I think Tolkien has done a good job of, like sort of drawing parallels to what's going on in different stories. Like I think in the last section that we read, part 2 of our coverage, Sam was reacting to sort of like realizing that like a blow was struck to Sauron when the Witch King was killed by Merry and Éowyn. And so like to see it happen again, to see it from the army's perspective was cool. You know, I think Aragorn he leads the army and then they start fighting, and then Gandalf takes off on those eagles pretty quickly because the eagles are coming. The famous line is being shouted like as soon as the chapter starts, I believe. You know, it's been said a million times, but these eagles, I thought during this reading I was thinking like how I would appreciate the eagles more if we sort of like visited their home territory in some way more. And I know I think maybe some of that's hit on in The Hobbit, but like sort of like seeing their culture and understanding them as a species rather than just like this sort of swoop in, save the day thing that happens twice in the course of...
Are you talking about the book of The Hobbit or the films? Because I don't remember much more in the book about it either. They just kind of show up, I think, too. Maybe there's a little more description in there. I haven't read it in a while, but...
Yeah, it's been too long for me to remember what's in The Hobbit as far as them, but I was just thinking, like, if set up, and that I think that's going to come to play a part, because the reason the appendices are so long is because there's so much more that Tolkien wanted to tell, but I think in order for the narrative to flow as he wanted it to, you know, a lot of the details are left out, and maybe there's a section on the eagle culture, but we didn't get it, so it does tend to feel like they just swoop in to save the day twice.
Yeah, and you know, one of the famous criticisms of this is like, why didn't they do it from the beginning? Why didn't they just fly the eagles to Mordor? And then there's been counter arguments about the Nazgul and lots of stuff like that. You know, is it a plot hole? Is it not a plot hole? I don't know. If the eye is still there and Sauron's still got all of his power, can he magically resist the eagles from entering and getting to where they need to go? You know, who knows? But yeah, I mean, it's something that I guess I'm struggling with this a little bit for this series, in that it feels like every angle has been discussed. So, yeah. You know what I mean? Like I want to touch on things that are popular and a lot of people have talked about, but on the other hand, it's like, I don't know what else to add to that discussion other than to say that I don't know the answer to it. I don't think anybody does, you know what I mean? And let's move on.
Right. All we can give is our sort of our sort of perspective on it, and like whether we think something is one way or the other. You know, I like I say, to each their own. If you think the Eagles could or could not have made it to Mordor with the ring in the first place and as a plot hole, like, cool. Yeah,
I feel like this is a pretty straightforward section here. You know, it's a rescue, and we're entering into a series of chapters that are like individual endings of different arcs, and we see characters being reunited. We get catching up with like certain characters who've been off, you know, screen for a little while, and finding out what they do here. It is interesting to me that the real climax of this series really does happen in the previous chapter, and then we get some wrapping up for a while here, followed by another like final small ending, which we'll get to. And this is sort of beginning the wrapping up of things.
Yeah, and people wonder why Peter Jackson has so many endings in his like Return of the King film, but I think it's because there's so many endings to the story in general.
Yeah.
You know, we have like the overarching climax that's kind of come to an end, and then we're going to get like sort of each individual character's endings on their own as we go.
Mm-hmm. Chapter 5 is called The Steward and the King. In Minas Tirith at the Houses of Healing, after the armies have departed, Éowyn is taken to see Faramir. Later, they see the arrival of the armies with Aragorn, Gandalf, and the 4 hobbits. Gandalf crowns Aragorn King of Gondor, and Aragorn makes Faramir Prince of Ithilien and keeps the office of Steward. Gandalf takes Aragorn to Mount Mendulion to survey the lands of his kingdom. On Midsummer's Eve, Elrond, Galadriel, Arwen, and the elves arrive in the city from the north to attend the wedding of Aragorn and Arwen. Okay, so a lot happens here again. We're getting a lot of movement, some political stuff here with Aragorn and Faramir, but I think one of the more interesting developments is the romance of Éowyn and Faramir. Really blossoms in this chapter out of the blue. And to me, it felt very natural. It felt like these are characters that make sense that they would find sort of common ground. And I also love that Éowyn didn't immediately just sort of give in to Faramir's, flirtations.
Yeah. It's interesting because, like, she's sort of still pining over Aragorn. So, like, looking out to the distance and hoping he'll come back and all of this. And it seems like they're looking out to the darkness, and eventually the darkness breaks, and we get a message from someone that, like, Aragorn and everybody have victory against Sauron and the middle and Mordor, and that's sort of when their romance they solidify their romance. Then we don't get that much of a perspective of women in Middle Earth, and so to see more of Éowyn. And I think it's in the appendices, they talk about how she's like Éowyn Shield Arm or something like that. Like she's known as like Éowyn Shield Arm, something like that. Because of the blow she took from the Witch King. So it's just cool to know that she's like a legendary figure within the Rohirrim. We also get Aragorn sort of making Faramir forever a steward of Gondor. Like his whole lineage and everything will forever be the stewards. And I thought that's really cool because it makes it so that he still has this place of stature for his lineage, for Boromir and Denethor.
Yeah. And, it's interesting how she can't bring herself to love Faramir until she has this moment of epiphany where she decides she is not going to be a shield maiden anymore and that she's going to become a healer. And when she makes this decision to change, now all of a sudden she's able to find appreciation for Faramir and love for Faramir. What do you think that's trying to say?
I feel like it kind of is sort of like leaning into gender stereotypes a little bit. It seems like she's maybe like, become a woman as the patriarchy is set up, and then we'll be married. But at the same time, I think it might have something to do with, going to battle and like having your mind on battle and war and things like that. And after a war, after something like this, sort of reverting back to like a normal life and sort of realizing that like, the time for love is here and like time to like sort of help others and becoming a healer, I think, is like the opposite of being someone who's, a shield bearer trying to hurt someone. So I would think at least. And
if I'm being gracious with it, which I tend to want to do, I think it also shows how her love of Aragorn was sort of bound up in her aspirations of being a great warrior. And when she lets go of that, it's interesting to me that she is no longer pining after Aragorn and is able to see Faramir, right? Like it shows me that maybe her love of Aragorn was conflated with her desire to be a warrior, and maybe that's what he represented to her. So if I'm being gracious, I see that, but I also definitely recognize that there may be some patriarchy stuff going on there too. So, who knows? But I just thought it was interesting to look at. I do want to quote something here that there was a particular exchange that I really loved. So Éowyn's having this discussion with the warden, who is sort of in charge of her, keeping her confined to her rooms and healing. And she's sort of having this sort of philosophical debate with him. And he says, "The world is full enough of hurts and mischances without wars to multiply them." And she says, "It needs but one foe to breed a war, not two, Master Warden. And those who have not swords can still die upon them." Which I thought was a profound sort of back and forth. Like I tend to agree with the Warden, right? Like that wars are on the whole and large quite terrible and lead to a lot of suffering and death, and that life is hard enough without them. But I think her response is an interesting one, and then one that's worth note as well, and that you can be as peaceful and not anti-war as you want, but if somebody comes along who is not that, they can still wage war upon you whether or not you believe in it. You know what I mean? It only takes one. And in that sense, like she says, if you don't have a sword, you can still die on one. And you can talk about guns, you can talk about weapons and that too. And I'm not saying that is the perfect worldview to have either. And I think there's more to that discussion. But I do think it is an interesting debate and one that is still going on. And I don't know. I kind of was arrested by this back and forth, and I kind of stopped and thought about it and like, how do I feel about this? And I like to sort of broaden it out and look at it from a societal point of view, right? Like there's a reason that countries have armies and have defense budgets. and stuff like
Right.
that. But that thinking can also get out of hand, right? And you can preemptively go a little bit nuts with your spending and the size of your weapon that you want to have, and
A lot of it has to do with just deterrence too. It's like, I have this massive army so that no one like attacks me, and so like having this sword means that no one will come after me because I have a sword. And like, where does it end? Where does it start?
And I think it's telling that Eowyn herself decides to put down her weapons and become a healer, right? Even after sort of having this discussion. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to this. I just thought it was an interesting debate to have, and it's something that I think is a question that goes on. So Faramir, like you said, he's sort of named as the warden in perpetuity and in service of Aragorn. And we hear talk about how the tree that the tree of Gondor, like, blooms again and grows again, and that the city itself gets mithril gates that the dwarves come and install, and how it's filled with trees from the elves, and over time it seems like it really prospers. I do like there's a moment where Baragond is taken before the king, and he's told that he's going to have to leave the guard because he violated his oath and slew his kinsmen on, like hallowed ground. And he's all like, oh shit. And he says like, usually, this action, you'd be condemned to death for doing it. But yeah, he says, but you did it out of love for Faramir. And so I'm instead appointing you as the captain of his white guard. And like, he's all like, oh yeah. And he sees that it was a fair and just thing, and all is well with Baragond. And I felt like this was the most Game of Thrones shit. I was like, this is the kind of thing that I could see a George R. R. Martin reading and going, there could be so much more to this. Because how much does this sound a little bit like Jaime Lannister? You know what I mean? Like, there's some just shades of gray here. All you have to do is say that one of the guys he slew was the son of a really important political figure in the city. And that guy is like, no, fuck that. He killed my son, and he's not allowed to do that. According to the tenets of his order, I demand he's executed, or I demand he's exiled. And then now all of a sudden you have a political struggle, and you have a king who maybe has to rely on this guy for some reason. So he can't just say, no, he did it for love, so it's fine. You know what I mean? Like, there's so much in here you could get into, and I just love the idea of people reading this and going, well, maybe it could be more complicated than that, and that would be interesting too. Right. And that's Game of Thrones, like, on its nose right there. Like, that's what that story is. And that's something that people point to with Tolkien. And I agree with, is like, sort of, he's very detail oriented, but at the same time, it's so much more about like everything going on that like we can't be, he wouldn't have been able to get the story told if he was worried about all of the smaller things, like that sort of the sort of political vyings and stuff. But that's why things like Game of Thrones exist, like you said. And that's why, tastes are different for different people, but I do like that. This is sort of like the idea that maybe this could have spawned a moment where George R. R. Martin as a kid read this and was like, here we go. Yeah, exactly. Like, what if? Well, because he talks a lot about how reading, I think some of the appendices and stuff, and even these winding up chapters I've heard him talk about, he had this question of like, what happens to all the orcs? There's just thousands and thousands of orcs, and like we hear a little bit about it, but he's like, is there a genocide? Are there millions of orcs who are just killed at the end of this? And if they're not killed, what happens to them? And what happens, over time? We hear some of basically Aragorn forgives everybody, right? And he pardons people, and he lets them go have their own lands. But like, that's such an easy answer to a very complex political issue, right? Like, what if the people who live next to the people, who were pardoned, doesn't agree that they should have this land? It's like, no, we should have this land. They were enemies of the crown. How dare they? So there's just like, there's so much that could be there, that it's all smooth here instead. Yeah. And I think that maybe lends itself back to sort of the idea that this story was in service of Tolkien's like love for language. Like he maybe he didn't want to explore those things. The politics didn't interest him as much. Because he wanted to just use this as like a lore story to back up sort of the culture behind a language and things like that. So anyway, let's move on. Real quick, I wanted to talk about Aragorn and Arwen coming together because, again, speaking of a character who wasn't really talked about that much, female character,
I was gonna give Tolkien shit, and then I read into the appendices like we did, and I feel like you can see there that in the appendices that there was a story that he wanted to tell, but he just felt that it would like kind of hinder the narrative because he did write it. I don't know. Where do you land on that?
Yeah, I mean, don't give him too much credit though. He buried it in the appendices.
He did bury it in the appendices, but like, so how do you feel? I'm not saying he's any, it's not he didn't do a great job of representing women in Middle Earth, obviously. But I'm just saying the fact that he wrote it means that he, it was a story that was worth telling at least.
Yeah, and I think it was smart of Peter Jackson to make it a little more front and center in the film, which we can get to. But yeah, I mean, Arwen was a character who I found completely disappointing in this series. Compared to what I was hoping for, you know what I mean? I was hoping to get more Arwen and understand her more. And like, I had to get all the way to the appendices of the final book before I even understood anything about Arwen really. And like what the romance was like between her and Aragorn and why it was so important to him and how she felt about it and the choices she had to make. Like almost all of that is, not a part of the Prime series. And I would be interested to know the percentage of readers who never read the appendices. I bet you it's pretty high. You know what I mean? Right. I think a lot of people stop when they get to the end, That's, the quote-unquote end. All right, but Aragorn and Arwen are married, and everything is going well. Now we get to chapter 6, which is called Many Partings. The company rides north to Rohan, then Isengard, where Gimli and Legolas head north through Fangorn. Aragorn returns to his kingdom, and the rest of the company heads north, where they meet Saruman and Wormtongue, who are just released from Isengard. Galadriel and Lorien elves leave over the pass to Caradhras, and the hobbits and Gandalf then arrive in Rivendell. So this begins an interesting part of the book, where it's like a travel log return. Like it's heading back to the Shire. You can feel that's where this is headed. And as they go, they sort of end the storyline and leave behind a group. And yeah, the first to go is Aragorn, and the elves leave and so forth. And Gimli and Legolas head off, and it's again sort of it's many partings. I guess it's right there in the title of the chapter.
Yeah. I like that we got to see Treebeard again as they traveled through, and sort of Treebeard talked about how like he tortured Saruman by forcing him to listen to stories and this like sort of news that he was getting.
Yeah, that was funny.
I like that a lot. I like Treebeard. I love Treebeard, but getting this little last section here was like a nice little icing on top because it was cool to see to again get him sort of saying. And like, I guess this is, this section here, the third part of our coverage can kind of be summarized in the fact that we're seeing men fully come to power. We're seeing, Aragorn plant the new seed of the tree of Gondor. We're seeing Treebeard as he's heading off, and I think Gandalf or someone says like maybe you'll see more Entwives, and Treebeard's like no, they're all gone. So it's sort of like this like.
But he does also say if you see any, let me know.
Exactly. Yeah. I forgot he says that to Merry and Pippin, which was awesome, and they're way taller now too, which is cool.
Yeah, and he gives them more. He gives them a little more, and he says, "Have a little more of this. Get a little bigger."
They keep getting bigger and bigger, which plays a part later. As we see all these characters go away. We're seeing the elves, this is kind of jumping ahead, but we're seeing the elves leave. We've seen that the dwarves are not well off after everything that's gone on, over the last few hundred years for them. Mm-hmm. The Ents are leaving, the hobbits we're going to talk about in a second, but men, like they're planting new trees, their city is shining with mithril. So we really are seeing like sort of the end of the Third Age and the rise of the Age of Men. As everyone's prophets, Gandalf has talked about, and all of that stuff. So
we learned later that Gimli actually is one of maybe the only dwarf to leave with the elves, and it's because of his friendship with Legolas. And so they have this like epic friendship that goes on, and
I love that. But or also in the appendices, it's also kind of stated maybe he went because he wanted to see Galadriel again. Yeah,
exactly. Okay. Him and his locks of hair that he's been holding onto forever. There was a really funny part where I think it was him and Éomer are debating whether or not Arwen or Galadriel is like fairer, and they're like, "Do I got to get my axe right now?" And he's like, "Well, I'll get my sword if you want to get your axe." And then they're like, "I'll grant you that is a reasonable opinion to have." I don't know. I thought it was funny. It's definitely a little sexist, but it was still also comical. We got to talk about Saruman right here, right? He's left the tower. He convinced Treebeard to let him go, and Gandalf keeps saying like, he could be up to some mischief. The power of his voice is not to be taken lightly, and it seems to have worked on you, Treebeard. He seems to have convinced you, and Saruman really feels like, in many ways, the most present and influential villain we have. Like Sauron is always off screen doing things. Like he's in the distance, he's in the shadows. Where Saruman, like we see him front and center a lot, right? And I feel like that's something that I'm going to give the books a lot of credit for. Is it feels like his story is way more complete, whereas it felt much more like a dangling thread for me in the films. Now I'll be curious because like I think I've only seen the extended version of the Lord of the Rings of the Return of the King maybe once. So I'm not even sure what all it might be in there that I'm forgetting about. So I'm going to be curious to see if we get some more stuff for him. But I think I'm remembering theatrical, which is like he's just kind of in Isengard and then forgotten, and that's the end of it. Like I don't remember much more than that. And here we get a lot more than that. And that's it begins with him and Wormtongue, who are on the street, and they get shown mercy. They're not killed. They're allowed to go off and do their own thing. And that comes back to bite our crew here a little bit. What was your thoughts on this whole exchange?
I mean, interesting to see Saruman here at the end. He is a character who, has been shown mercy, and like you talked about earlier, Gandalf, everyone's shown him mercy, even after all the stuff that all the vying that he had for power and sort of everything that he put in motion. He's still shown mercy and is still a threat, is still dangerous, and yet they're just like, all right, there he goes. Just know he's around, everyone. Make a mental note. But yeah, and his relationship with Wormtongue is one that I'm sure we'll talk more about in a little bit. But he's still following Saruman, seemingly because of the power of his voice, maybe because of the sort of influence that he still has. But yeah, I did not expect to see him here. I'll put it that way, because I don't want to say anything about the movie.
Have you've read this book before, right?
Yeah, but it's been a long time.
Been a long time. Okay, so you didn't remember everything that went down, maybe?
No, did not remember everything. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, news to me. I did not expect this at all. I also want to touch on, before we leave this chapter, we reunite with Bilbo here. And I have a really fond spot in my heart for Bilbo because I grew up on The Hobbit, and he was sort of my like OG Hobbit was Bilbo, way before Frodo. You know what I mean? And so it was kind of nice to come back to him. And he's old now. He's getting sort of senile. It seems like he's forgetting things a lot. He keeps falling asleep during conversations. And I thought there was an interesting moment where he asked Frodo to help him finish writing his stories. And I was wondering, and I don't know if anyone can answer this, but I just thought about how Christopher Tolkien, who recently passed away, so R.I.P., he is, the son of Tolkien, and in many ways sort of oversaw his legacy and oversaw the Lord of the Rings into the modern age.
You were talking about Peter Jackson's influence. You have to think about Christopher being able to sort of continue the legacy of his father as well, up until the movies came out and after.
Yeah. Do you think that this was J.R.R. Tolkien talking to Christopher Tolkien at all here? And do you think he identified with Bilbo and says, I want you to carry on the story and I want you to be the sort of caretaker of it?
I mean, I would like to think that. I don't know how the dates, like how old is Tolkien at this point in his life in the 50s. But like the idea of having that sort of be a parallel there would be really cool. And you were talking about Bilbo, like I feel the same way. Like I read The Hobbit before I read Lord of the Rings, and so like to see old Bilbo like this and just thinking about like, oh, he's earned it. Like he's earned his old age. He's earned sort of getting the chance to just be like relax and like at one point they talk about it, like Bilbo's like, of course I was invited to the wedding of Arwen and Aragorn, but I had things to do here. And I'm like, don't even worry about it. You've already been on your adventure. Just stay at home and do whatever you want to do. It's nice to see him older, and also to kind of go against something I was talking about earlier. He's a ring bearer who was still haunted by the ring. He had the ring for a long time and was still haunted by it, but seemingly affected maybe the least of anyone. because like he had it for decades, right? He had it after the events of The Hobbit, and still was able to give it away, even though he, you know, sort of snaps every time he sees it.
Yeah, there was kind of a chilling moment where he talks about like, oh, I would have liked to have seen the ring again. And you can see that it still has this effect on him of like, oh, it's a shame that you had to get rid of it, but I know that that's why you went, you know. And he also seems like so convincingly like an old man here. But yeah, just the way he still has this fondness for the ring, I think really shows sort of the effect it had on him. All right, Chapter 7 is called Homeward Bound. The hobbits and Gandalf arrive in Bree, where they stay at the Prancing Pony, and are told by Butterbur that there has been trouble in Bree while they have been away. All right, so again, we keep hearing talk of trouble. And I thought it was really interesting that Gandalf has been hearing all of this and says, at the end of it, my time is done helping you, and you're going to have to figure this out on your own. And he knows full well that everything he's been hearing, like he's a smart guy, he knows that that something bad is going on in the Shire, and yet he leaves before they get there, and he lets them handle it on their own. And I think it's important to note when we get to the Scouring of the Shire and how it's operating in the story here.
Right. Seeing Gandalf leave the company of the Fellowship, and just seeing as everybody branches off is so heartbreaking. Yeah. And then seeing Gandalf ride off at the end of it, I don't know. It's just, it feels very final. And, you know, I think before the Fellowship actually breaks for the first time, somebody mentions, maybe Gimli mentions how this may be the last time that they're all together at once. And, you know, I was thinking, like, what about Boromir? Because clearly you guys will never be together again. But he means, like, the remaining Fellowship members. The living Fellowship,
yeah. Yeah, and it is sad, like, with every peeling away. And then it's also, there was an article I read where Ted Chiang, author of The Story of Your Life, which is the inspiration for Arrival, and many other great pieces of sci-fi. He had an essay recently, or an interview I think he gave, where he was talking about how in science fiction, if you look at stories where the end of the story marks a return to the status quo, that those stories are, by definition, more traditional and therefore more conservative. And if you look at stories where there is no return to status quo, and instead you go to something new and something different, that is inherently more progressive. And I found that I was thinking about that a lot as we were entering into the final stages of this story here, and how it differs from the movies, and how I think rightfully so, this is often described as a more conservative piece of fantasy, yet here we see our characters returning to their home and returning to the status quo, and yet encountering difficulty getting there. And sure, by the end of it, maybe they are back. They fight their way back to the status quo. But there's a challenge there, and there's a difference. And when they return home, they find it changed. Even
if they do return to status quo for a certain period of time, ultimately, at the very, very end of the story, things are not the same. I think there's sacrifices that have been made. And I think Tolkien is smart to lean on the fact that, like, there were sacrifices made and things do change. And I think maybe, you know, that to me speaks to, like, going away to war and then coming back and feeling everything changed, and sort of you being changed yourself. And we'll talk about that when we talk about Frodo and sort of dealing with how he deals with the Shire.
Yeah. Chapter 8 is the Scouring of the Shire. Like I said, Gandalf leaves. It was nice to be back at the Prancing Pony. You know, I love a good fantasy inn, and Prancing Pony is probably the most famous, you know, freaking inn in all of fantasy. So it was cool to be back there. And then I think it's a fitting place to be sort of the final place where then Gandalf leaves shortly thereafter. And we leave Bree, and we're back finally in the Shire, and it's just the four hobbits. It's Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, right? And they come in, and I love there's this moment where they realize that, like, they haven't been seeing any of this trouble that they keep hearing about, and they realize that it's because they're wearing armor and they have magic swords, and they're like, you know, they're level 20 in D&D parlance, and we're some badasses right now, and no one's gonna fuck with us, and that's why.
Not to mention Merry and Pippin are, like, massive for hobbits.
Yeah, they're like 6 foot tall now. They're not, but they're getting taller and taller.
They're large,
like.
yeah.
Anyway, I thought that moment was funny, but I think it's also, let's get into the Scouring Shire, then I'll touch in on it. So chapter 8 is called The Scouring of the Shire. This is a very famous chapter. Does not appear in, you know, this event doesn't happen in in the films. So let's really dig into it here. The hobbits arrive in the Shire to find it has been taken over by the Chief, or Sharky, at Bag End. The Battle of the Bywater happens, and the hobbits find Saruman and Wormtongue are at Bag End, posing as Sharky. Wormtongue then kills Saruman and is killed himself by hobbit archers. All right, so that's everything that happens at the Scouring of the Shire. This is something I kind of knew was coming, but I thought, for whatever reason, that there was like orcs or something that had invaded the Shire. But it actually seems to be more like men and just some like ruffians and thugs that were employed by Saruman. So it is sort of forces of the Dark Lord, but yeah, it was different than I thought it was going to be, and I'm not sure where I got the sort of wrong idea, but Saruman is at the head of it all, and he is Sharky, which actually I will admit I didn't realize it was going to be him. I was sort of surprised by that.
So all of this like Scouring of the Shire stuff is interesting because very clearly I think it's to show the growth of our characters. These were they were young kids in the Shire when they left, and the goings on of the Shire probably seemed big to them at that point. And now they come back and sort of like seeing that like a lot of the hobbits won't fight back because they don't want to die and this and that, and like seeing all the sacrifice that they've seen. I think leads to them being like Pippin leads the battle, right? Yeah. And a lot of them have huge roles to play here, and like Frodo's running around trying to stop people from killing people and helping people.
Frodo's done fighting, man. He's like, I don't want to see any more killing if I don't have to.
But so to think of the men who come into the area, it's just like they've now heard of this like sort of easygoing paradise where they can just go in and take control of all these smaller people. And just live the high life and have them be basically slaves and do whatever they want and take all of their resources and everything. And yeah, it's crazy that hadn't happened before, right? It's crazy that like the orcs hadn't rolled in, like you said, or like that any forces had ever really touched the Shire. And maybe they did. Maybe I just didn't get that backstory. Yeah.
And so I think rightfully so. The Lord of the Rings is described as like as an example of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, right? And one of the key features of the hero's journey is that you return home changed. And we're seeing that here, like this is them returning home changed by their experiences. And I want to give Tolkien credit here because I really like this, that I like that even though the people who didn't leave home might look at them and say like, oh, I barely recognize you. You've been going around with all these fancy folk and you've been off with all these other people that we don't trust. And yet there's a strength that they have earned through that. Right. And they wouldn't be able to handle the situation here if they hadn't been through that and they hadn't learned from all these people that they've met, and they didn't have the experiences of leaving home. And so to me, it's really saying something about like, needing to get out of your comfort zone and go experience life and go experience other cultures and go experience other things and learn from it. And then even if you do return home, which not everyone does, we could talk about how like Frodo ends up leaving. But even if you do return home, that like you can take those experiences with you and they'll be a strength for you. Right. And so I like that part of it too, right? And that strength is on display here when we get the battle, and we get the final interaction with Sharky, aka Saruman, who I think Sharky's a really funny freaking name for him to have chosen for himself.
I think I'm gonna exclusively refer to him as Sharky from now on. Anytime I'm talking about like, oh, the forces of Sharky.
I wanted to give Tolkien credit there because I feel like I've been giving him a lot of shit for sort of the political standpoint of this book. And I don't want to reduce it to a political sort of binary of like either it is conservative or it is not. And you know what I mean? And like, I think there is elements of it that can be viewed either way. And also not to say that one is good and one is bad. You know what I mean? Like, I think it's more complicated than that. Just like anything, the political spectrum is very complicated. I know we live in a country where it is not right now. It is incredibly polarized. But this is a series that I don't think fits necessarily neatly into one or the other. I don't know what else to say other than I think it's more complicated than that.
Yeah. So what did you think of the Scouring of the Shire? Like, did you as an event within the story?
So I liked it. So it feels weird pacing wise. Right. But I think it fits the series that is written. And that is a series where we spent a ton of time in the Shire at the beginning of the books, right? We spent years, we spent all this time exploring the situation in the Shire. You know, like we talked about, we kind of made jokes about how like, oh, this ring is really dangerous and has to be taken immediately. All right, 15 years passed, 20 years passed, you know, and we were kind of joking about that. And that book and that beginning needs, I think, or earns this ending. And that's where, like, we've come all the way back around, and now the ending of the Shire story gets a chapter to be explored, right? And that's what I think the Scouring of the Shire is. And it works for these books. I don't think that it would have worked in the films. And we can get to that when we get to the movies. I think it was smart to leave it out. But here I think it does work, and I think that it does feel kind of like an extra ending, which is kind of surprising. But that's okay. And
right.
Books, I think, get a little more leeway with their structure. And I think that it is sort of a second ending here that we get.
He has so many endings within the story, and yet there's so many extra stories that he could have added in that also could have felt like, you know, endings and sort of more context and all of this. So the things he decided to cut and the things he decided to leave within his lore is, I don't know, it's interesting. Like, I understand the importance of sort of this final sort of conflict here for the growth of the hobbits, and also to show Frodo so not being able to like click back in to the Shire life, not being able to you know, revert back. Clearly, I think he has some PTSD. I think he's got like, you know, he's thinking about his injuries. He's like, you know, he'll be sick one day and fine the next day, and ultimately, I guess it's in the next chapter, but ultimately deciding to leave. Oh, one thing, old Tom Bombadil, old Tom Bombadillo. Gandalf goes to meet with him.
Yeah,
at the very end of the story here,
but he doesn't make an appearance though. He stays off.
But I mean, just like speaking of wild characters that were cut from the movies, Tom Bombadil continues to be this sort of, I don't know, otherworldly, and learning more about the Valar and like sort of the one god above all within the Lord of the Rings, or just at least like learning more about that makes me think like, where does Tom Bombadil fit within all that? He seems like a nature being, you know. He seems like something that's just all, like, he seems like a god. He could be one of the Valar. I don't know.
Yeah, he does feel like a god to me. I agree. I don't know, man. That's stuff that I don't feel qualified. I feel like I have to like really dig into the Silmarillion or something to like really know how to talk about Tom Bombadil and his role. What about Gandalf and him going to talk to him? What does that mean?
Right. I don't know. Maybe that's his source, right? Maybe he's always been getting all his information from Tom Bombadil all written out. And then he's like, all right.
No, didn't he say like, I wasn't prepared to talk to him before, but like now I am. I want to have a really deep conversation with him or something.
Yeah, I think so. And I think he also like, doesn't he report back and say like, yeah, he was not interested in anything that we had going on?
No, I think he's I don't know that we talked to Gandalf again after that, but I think it was more like that was his theory. He's like, I don't think he's going to have cared much about what happened.
That's probably what it was. Yeah.
Which I'm like, really? Oh, okay. I don't know. Maybe. Tom Bombadil is a bizarre character. Just leave it at that. I want to talk about the final bit here with Saruman and Wormtongue, because once again, we see mercy, right? We see Frodo saying, don't kill him, don't kill him, don't kill him. And yet we know that he's this reprehensible character, and he sort of, through his own evil, gets himself killed, right? Like, he's been twisting Wormtongue, he's been bullying Wormtongue, and then finally Wormtongue stabs him, and then Wormtongue himself gets shot to death by the hobbits before Frodo can stop them. And again, to me, this feels like some sort of divine justice that I don't know that I love the message here. It seems to be very much like you don't have to get your hands dirty, because karma will come in and take care of it. You know what I mean? Like, don't worry about it. Karma is going to take care of it.
Right, which comes back to what I was talking about before. It's great to be idealistic, but like, you're gonna get taken advantage of. You can think that like, oh, karma will take care of it, but in the meantime, like, you know, whoever wants to do evil is doing the evil they want to do. So it's a kind of like a double-edged sword. This
is the polar opposite of Game of Thrones. Like, this is the fundamental difference in Game of Thrones, where characters who karma should punish, karma does not punish, right? Like,
and characters who have good karma don't like get awful things done to them.
Exactly. And it felt weird to me to repeatedly be giving Saruman a pass, and then yet Frodo is able to keep his hands clean, and our characters are able to keep their hands clean and stick to their principles, and yet still justice is served. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, it's very convenient.
Right.
And it not one of my favorite bits, but that's just personally, I think it is in keeping with the philosophy of the Lord of the Rings and what has been presented. It's consistent. I just don't personally love this worldview or the way that it works in the plot here, even.
Yeah.
All right, Chapter 9, The Grey Havens. So several years pass spent cleaning up the Shire. Sam and Frodo meet the elves and Bilbo traveling west through the Shire. They travel to the Grey Havens, where they meet Gandalf, and Merry and Pippin arrive. Frodo, Bilbo, and Gandalf and the elves all sail to the west, and Sam returns to Rose and their daughter, Eleanor, at Bag End. And that is the end. Okay, so let's get into this final chapter here.
I mean, I think this is the one that's really full of mystery for a lot of people that want to know, like, what takes place after the events of Lord of the Rings. Like, why are they going west? What is in the west? And we get like this glimpse of something, this like seeming paradise. Is it heaven? Is it, is an allegory for heaven? Is it the ending of suffering? Is it, that's what it kind of seems like.
It's what it feels like,
time, right? But at the same time, it's really sad for the people who stay behind. So, seeing Sam have this like, Sam and Frodo finally had this like glorious time together. They had the most bountiful summers together in the Shire, and Sam is having children, and every once in a while Frodo seems weird, but ultimately like they live near each other. Sam is happy because he's married and
Sam moves in and moves into Bag End with Rosie.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. And
so like that's like the idyllic sort of ending, right? That's the ending that everybody's hoping for if you like that kind of ending. But we have Frodo who's kind of, he's not the same, and I think Arwen offers him long before this the like her spot on the boat on the way west. Mm-hmm. So this is his chance to take it. And it's crazy because Sam doesn't know as they're heading out to the dock until Bilbo mentions that they're heading out, and then I think Frodo says he is as well. And it's heartbreaking. And like when I watch this scene in the movie too, it's also heartbreaking. It's the end of it all, and seemingly saying goodbye is a very finite goodbye. It's like this is the death of these characters. This is the death of, and just thinking of, how you feel about death and whether they're going to a great place or not. They're leaving you behind, or you're leaving them behind. So, yeah, it's pretty emotional stuff.
Frodo finishes the story. He finishes Bilbo's story. And that's like seems like one of the last things he really wanted to do. He writes it down. He writes it all down. And once he's done that, it feels like he doesn't feel like he has anything left to give, and he has anything left to do in this world. And it does feel like a symbolic death in a sense. But in a way, you're not supposed to treat it like a death. You're supposed to treat it like they're going off to another realm to live just, I guess, happy lives.
Right, but they're not coming back.
But they're not coming back, and we don't hear anything about this world. So it seems like a heaven, right? It seems like an afterlife. Yeah. And we get this final bit where Merry and Pippin come with Sam, and they accompany him back, and they're sad, but they're also sort of glad that they're together at the end here. And I thought that was a moving bit. And I like when Gandalf says, "I will not say do not weep, for not all tears are an evil." I think it's Gandalf who says that, right?
I think so.
And I mean, I think that's again one of many great quotes in this book, in this series. And I like that we end with Sam, who is sort of one of our main characters by the end here, and he is returning home, and the final line of the series is, "Well, I'm back," he said, and that's the end of the books. Yeah,
when I read that, I was like, God damn it, Tolkien, you son of a bitch, you did it! What a way to end the story! Like just that last line,
is
really good.
And personally for me, like I just moved back into my home after being out for 3 months, while reading this, so I thought that was quite appropriate, right? Like it feels very final, and it's like I'm back in my home, and I've, been through all this crazy shit, but I'm back now. And
like you were saying before, this could seem sort of like the conservative back to the status quo, seemingly for almost all the characters. Even though it's like the world's completely turned upside down, Sam is back, so maybe it's the more conservative end for him.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Yeah, it's crazy how we've talked about it on the podcast before, but it's crazy how these stories mirror a lot of the things, or you can at least like sort of you can sort of put them up against your own life, and so it sort of mirrors the things that we're doing. And so for you to get back in the get back line, I understand why it's like kind of haunting, but at the same time it's nice because it's like you can always
it's comforting,
relate,
right?
Yeah,
and a return to the status quo, and I maybe should have explored this a little bit more when Ted Chiang was talking about it. And the reason that's viewed that way is because the status quo is only comforting to those who benefit from it, right? And if you don't benefit from the status quo, then a return to the status quo is not a comforting ending, clearly. But
if you're like part of a revolution and then everything returns to the status quo, that means that you lost and it's not great for you.
You failed. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, but on the other hand, everybody has, not everybody, but everybody wants to have a home, and many people have one. And hopefully your home is a place where you find comfort. And if that's the case, then everybody can sort of understand that feeling of like coming back to safety and coming back to feeling like, you've gone through a journey, yet now you can rest. And I think that's a comforting place to end here. And I think that in a time like now where there's a lot of uncertainty in the world, it's just nice to feel that way. And that's one of the things that I love about watching the movies is I feel like we've talked about, especially in Fellowship, like really captures that homey feel. And we return to it here at the end. And it I don't know, it feels right for me and it feels right for this series. But we've got to get into these appendices, man. We've got to.
Let's do it.
Real quick, let's blast through them. Just hit me with anything that you found was really interesting. For one for me, I'll just hit right off the bat. Amon Amarth is the name of a metal band, and apparently it also means Mount Doom, which I found out from reading the appendices.
So they got their name from Tolkien then, right?
Yeah, it must have been. Yeah, because that means Mount Doom.
That's awesome. That's super
Anyway,
cool.
So random things you find reading the appendices.
Oh my gosh, there's so much. I mean, I really liked learning about, like I said before, I feel like I've said a lot of what I really enjoyed about it, but it's like anything to do with the First Age, the Second Age, sort of hearing about, the Sauron and like what it was like before, what it was like for Sauron before he was any sort of like evil, magic Hitler, as we talked about before. And like, Morgoth and sort of the how he was.
What
like
about Angmar? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the Witch King, like we get a lot of Witch King stuff, and we hear that like he caused a lot of havoc and was like the leader of all these, all these wars and a lot of the stuff that happened in ages previous, where it seems like the Witch King was a really important figure in a lot of this stuff, and we hear about his power and he had one of the rings, or he ended up getting one of the rings. I don't remember it all, but it was interesting. There's a lot of that stuff, and it showed like how important a figure he was in like the previous age.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's kind of like the ghosts of the spirits of the path of the dead, in the way that like it's sort of things from the past coming to play a part. Like this is just this is a king of old who's like affecting the present.
Well, we hear about the wars that happened at the Barrow Downs and all this stuff, like these areas we've been to, and at Weathertop there was this like really big battle with the Aragorn. What is the Aragorn people?
Numenor.
No,
the Dunedain.
The Dunedain. I think there's like a big battle at Weathertop, right? And like all this stuff, and it's like, if I had known all of this, I would have had more historical context to all these areas. But I guess it kind of works in a way that you don't know it all too. So it was just cool to get some of these background stories, and a lot of it's up to me. Like I finally realized what he was doing. Essentially, he would go back to like way back for a section, and then he would work all his way to the present, and then you'd get a little bit of what happens after. So you'd often hear about like what happened with, say, Rohan and Eomer as king, and and how he operated, and or you hear about like Gimli going with Legolas, and
we get tons of Aragorn too.
Well, I was gonna say one of the biggest ones is the story of Arwen and Aragorn, right? And we get a lot of like what happened in the past all the way leading up to what happened after. So yeah, you want to talk about them at all?
Well, yeah, the past, like learning about how, Elrond was, how against he was, how much he was against Aragorn when he was young.
Well, so Aragorn's father, it was a Dunedain who was killed, and then he went to live with Elrond, and then while he was there, he like became smitten with Arwen.
Exactly, and so Elrond was not about that. He hated it. And clearly, even through the
well, he
book,
even said like you would have to be the king of both Gondor and Anor to be worthy of her, right? So that's the whole reason that Aragorn did it, I guess.
It's a winding story, and to not have this in the actual text is
Yeah.
Do I think it hurts Aragorn and Arwen a little bit? Yes, but at the same time, I think
it hurts their romance. That's for sure.
Yeah. But think about, I don't know. Do you think it fits in the story? You think you can just plop it in somewhere and have it be like a flashback, or?
No, you don't plop it in. You weave it in.
You weave it in. I just mean, but so if you do weave it in, do you think that a lot of it would need to be cut from what we just read in the appendices? Do you think it's
I think you take it out of the appendices and you weave it in, and then you have a little bit more love in your story about swords and people on horseback. I think Tolkien didn't want that. For better or for worse, that's what he didn't want it.
And are there really flashbacks in his sort of story? It was kind of propelled forward constantly only in the present, right? Yeah. Maybe I guess technically there's, if you think of it as like a flashback, if we're,
There was flashbacks and flash forwards throughout this book. There would be times where we'd get history, or we'd get even like in days to come, they would say this, and like,
right.
So time was a little loose. I think it could have been done. He just didn't want to. He didn't want it to be part of the main story. And you know what I mean? Some people would like that. I, for one, think that we could have gotten a little bit more of this in the actual book itself. But
what did you think about all the sections with the Durin's folk?
Oh, about the dwarves?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, that was fun, and honestly, I think I was like, oh, this is some of the stuff that we get in some of the Hobbit films.
Yeah.
Because we got a lot more of like Thorin Oakenshield, and like how he got the name of Oakenshield, and the name of some of the like orc leaders that he slew. I did like the discussion of this like underground war between the orcs and the bearded folk that no one else knew about, that raged for many, many years.
We learn about what happened with Moria before, when the Fellowship entered Moria, and Gimli sees what happened to the dwarves in Moria for the first time.
Yeah,
and then it's also nice to see like all of the things leading up to the Hobbit are in the appendices there, and then basically nearing the end we learn about Smaug is like the the greatest of the golden dragons, and he goes in and takes advantage of, or like basically kills all the dwarves in order to get their gold and everything. They've dug too deep because of their greed, and then ultimately at the end it's like, and that is explored in another story, basically.
Yeah. Well, and I also kind of recontextualize this stuff, and I want to know, do you think this is retconning, where it kind of says that like Gandalf recognized what sort of a weapon Smaug would be in the hands of Sauron, and so it was like they had to take care of it before he could like use him.
Probably.
And that makes sense, but it feels a little bit like retconning to me, because I'm like, I don't think that was why Gandalf did it originally. I don't think he knew about what was going on.
When he first wrote The Hobbit, he probably didn't have all the information, so yeah, probably a little bit, but we also don't know, like, the way he wrote the story was like, clearly, he's covering millennia, and he's like all over the place, so who knows what he wrote first.
Well, let's take it at face value. It's an interesting thought, right? Like, if Smaug was still around, would he have served Sauron, or would he have been too proud? Like, how would that have worked? It seems like he could have been, and if he had been, can you imagine fucking Smaug at the head of the armies? Sauron, like, that would have been a game changer, so in that sense, like, Bilbo's journey is incredibly important, in that he was able to take that figure off. I want to know more about dragons in Middle Earth. It doesn't seem like Smaug is the only dragon yet.
No.
Where are all the dragons? You know what I mean? Like,
they talked about in the appendices, they said like most of them were killed off.
I guess.
But,
was Smaug the last living dragon? I don't know. I would have liked to know more about the dragons. So, I mean, that's what a lot of there's a lot of room. I guess that's one thing I'll give Tolkien credit for. Even with all the histories he gave a lot of room and a lot of space for other fantasy to explore, other stories that could fit in a fantasy world like this. Mm-hmm.
I think he explored everything he possibly could in a lifetime. And what's crazy is like just to have created something that has all these gaps that could still be filled in. And like I think a lot of I don't really know who's controlling the Tolkien estate at this point. Clearly his family, I think, in some capacity.
Yeah.
But like there are still games and there are still books that are coming out that are like using manuscripts. And
sure.
I don't know the games as much, but definitely the books are using manuscripts and sort of like Silmarillion and some of this appendices stuff. So I don't know. It's cool to see that like maybe his legacy can be continued through other people telling his stories, but at the same time, like how do we feel about somebody not Tolkien kind of fully realizing these stories?
I mean, I guess I'm fine with it, but I'm sort of in the camp of like, I feel like The Lord of the Rings has had many moments to be the thing to be talked about, yet I feel that it is more a bit of classic literature at this point.
Right.
And I think as someone, and, I have a vested interest in modern fantasy, but I do lament the fact that there are many readers of fantasy who their taste in fantasy begins and ends with Tolkien.
Right.
And that is sort of it's kind of like, we talked about this a little bit, I think, with like Stephen King and horror. Like there are many readers of horror who their taste in horror begins with Carrie and ends with, whatever the latest book is that Stephen King has put out. And like, that's all the horror they read. And that's all the horror they're interested in. And I think both of those are very sort of closed off. And, at least Stephen King is a living author. So, I'll give you some credit for that. But like Tolkien is not and hasn't been for a while. So it's sad to think that there are a lot of people out there who like this is the end all be all fantasy for them. And they don't want to read anything else. And they don't think anything else is, of value that wasn't written.
It comes back to what I was talking about before. I think it's like if you don't diversify and you don't seek other stories, then you're closing, like you said, you're closing yourself off. And there's so many other opportunities out there for you to experience. So like I agree. Like there's so much to explore with Middle Earth. If you want to, you can go read it constantly and learn something new. And all his manuscripts and all that stuff is there. But yeah, like any modern fantasy is still growing and learning from Tolkien and standing on the shoulders of Tolkien. And I think some days
or not. There's a lot of fantasy that's being written purposely delving into other backgrounds and not drawing from the West and saying, like you look at some, books like The Poppy War or just, Jade City, you've talked about, like they take from completely different, histories and from authors who've never read Tolkien, don't want to read Tolkien. And that's fine.
Right. Yeah, I think to like you said, to close yourself off to these stories is doing yourself a disservice because there are so many voices and there's so many adventures that you could never have in Middle Earth that you could be experiencing. And I think one day, somebody will write something greater than Lord of the Rings. Like it's like bound to happen. If time is infinite, if time is infinite, then like who knows what's going to happen. And I think to forever think Lord of the Rings is the best thing and to continue to read it over and over is sort of what I was talking about before, the dangerous side of fandom.
Sure. And I do also want to bring it back though. Like I am a fan of the Lord of the Rings. I am a fan of those films and I liked the series. And as a fantasy fan, I like that this was the foundation in many ways of Dungeons and Dragons, which is a game I love, which is itself such an important, piece of media and an important thing in our society that has led to so many other games. And so like all of our video games that were based off of it and card games and things that grew out of Dungeons and Dragons, which grew out of The Lord of the Rings. So I recognize how deep the roots go, how big the shadow is, and how important this is in fantasy. And I also don't want to seem like I'm discounting that. So I guess it seems like I'm straddling the fence here, and that's how I really feel. Like I am of two minds about it. I recognize what it is. I like that it can be comforting in a time like now, and I see how historically important it is. Yet I also see the dangers inherent in becoming obsessed with it and not seeing any other things having value and feeling like this is the end all be all. And I think that is not. I don't ascribe to that viewpoint, and I don't think that is a healthy way to look at it in a way that is going to open yourself. You're like you said, you're going to close yourself off to other stories and other pieces of fantasy out there if you do that too much. I don't know. I think I'm saying the same things over and over again, so I'm probably rambling. Do you have anything else to add about this? Do you want to give your takes here at the end of all things, James?
There's no denying that I'm a massive fan of this series.
Yeah.
It's meant so much to me for such a long time. to really dig into it. Like, this is, I think, part of what the podcast is about. And, you know, any criticism is hopefully just to show, you know, the potential of what stories can be. And I think this is a story that forever will be very important. And yeah, I mean, it's so affecting to me, and it means so much. And I honestly am probably pretty biased about it at this point, because it's meant so much to me. But as long as even if you are biased like I am, I think it's as long as you're open to new experiences and open to new stories and things like that, that's what's important.
Right. All right. Well, I want to leave a little bit of meat left on the bone for next week when we're getting into these films, and we'll truly be putting the cap on our Lord of the Rings coverage. We have one more episode. We hope you join us for Peter Jackson's epic 4.5 hour extended cut. We're going to be watching something crazy like that, almost 5 hours. I don't know. I don't know how long it is, but you know, honestly, I'm looking forward to it. And maybe I'll even watch Fellowship and Two Towers again if I have time. But like we said earlier, we are going to be discussing the biopic Tolkien. This week, we're going to probably record that and put it out soon. Look for that. If you are a patron, if you want to find out how to become a patron, go to patreon.com/inktofilm. You can financially support us with as little as $1 a month. Get access to different things. We have different tiers on there. Take a look at it if you're curious about that. Any financial help at this time is greatly appreciated.
And make sure to follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all those at @InkToFilm. And join our Council of Inklings. It's actually, speaking of which, Council of Inklings, if you go all the way back to our Fellowship episode, comes from The Lord of the Rings.
Right.
So join the Council of Inklings. We post polls, we post news, we post all kinds of stuff in there. Anything we see that's adaptation adjacent or maybe a potential project in the future, check that out.
Absolutely. And if you liked this episode, please let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever podcast app you use. Or if you happen to be listening to this on YouTube, like the video, subscribe to the channel. It's the first time I'm going to say that. But our YouTube channel has been doing decent of late, and I would like to continue to have it grow. So absolutely, subscribe. Make sure you do that and give us a like.
Thank you to Music Archive for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, we'll be back next week for the final film. But until next time,
thanks for listening.